My apologies if my desktop decides to blank. I'm not sure how to turn that feature off. So, as probably most of you know, Bitcoin is based on proofs of work. You have this general concept that in blockchains generally, you have some scoring function for a history, and if someone is trying to determine which is the correct history among competing ones, they just compare the weights, and the one with the greater weight wins, or will eventually be ahead. It is a pretty reliable assumption to make out of the system, and the way the incentives are set up, everyone just builds on top of the one with the greatest weight, and that just kind of keeps working. The problems with using proof of work are, number one, it's just wasteful. You have warehouses full of computers literally doing nothing whatsoever. Uh, and it's also quite centralized. You wind up with a few people who acquire lots and lots of custom pieces of hardware that mine particularly well and have particularly cheap access to electricity, kind of doing everything. So it's supposed to be a very decentralized protocol, and in practice, it's not as decentralized as it's really supposed to be. So it would be nice to not have these problems, and a good thing to do is to use proofs of space. You make it so that instead of mining, you have farming. The bottleneck on how much weight you can add to the chain has to do with how much storage capacity you're allocating to the thing. And there's an economic argument of why this works well. It's that people are spending over $100 billion a year on storage media, and at any time, about half of that is actually utilized. So if you could hand out farming rewards that are a small fraction of that, but allow essentially all of the unutilized capacity there to be farmed, with the people who own it hardly even noticing the difference as far as their performance was concerned, then this wouldn't create any extra incentives for waste in the system, and it would be fairly decentralized because the storage is actually decentralized among a large number of parties who own it. The basic idea here is there's a lot of sunk cost and a lot of replacement cost on all this storage, but you want to do clever tricks to allow very low marginal cost of utility, of proving that you have it. I want to be clear, I'm not talking about useful storage here. This is not data that somebody's generating and asking for back again later. This is storing a very particular kind of gibberish that's only really useful for proofs of space. I'll get to later about why that other thing is a bad idea. So this all sounds great. The problem is you have this feature that it doesn't really take any energy to do your farming. But this creates problems related to it not costing anything to do your farming. The most basic one is a grinding attack, which is an attacker just tries different histories. That they have a certain amount of storage capacity, and they're like, well, here's my honest history, but I'll just twiddle a bit, come up with another history, and another one, and just keep doing lots of these until they find one that's works better than the others and move forward with that. And now we're back to what Bitcoin is doing. This is like something we don't want to have happen. Now, Bitcoin fixes this by embracing it. In Bitcoin, a grinding attack is the normal operation of the system, so you don't have to worry about grinding attacks, which works, but is not ideal and not what we're trying to accomplish with our proofs of space here. Because as soon as you embrace grinding attacks, it really is all about expending more CPU. And there's lots of ways this can be done. There are lots of cryptographic primitives which can be malleated in all kinds of ways for valid values. Another kind of attack is a rewriting attack, which is actually sort of the easier one to explain why it's a big deal. So in a history rewriting attack, you might have something where the system's been around for like 10 years, and there's someone who's like a 20%, it has 20% of the capacity today, but the capacity has been going up very rapidly over time. So as of a year ago, they had like 1,000% capacity. And because it doesn't actually cost them anything to redo history, they just make a whole new history since Genesis. They're just a completely new thing. And their history will have greater weight than the honest one. The amount of, it will be more smeared out instead of top heavy, but it will in fact score as having greater weight. And you can go, well, let's just throw in some checkpoints here and there, just assume that you never go back more than a year or something. That tends to create a lot more problems than it solves. It adds in all kinds of other issues. You really, really want to have the property that someone can just join and figure out what's going on, rather than having to check in periodically to know what's actually happening. This is actually, the potential for doing this in Bitcoin is actually a lot more than people think it is. If someone were to like rewrite the last day's worth of history of Bitcoin, they'd be being a jerk, but they would be getting their mining rewards for it. That they would have mining rewards, no problem. Same as if they'd mined off of the honest head. So it's actually, I'll get to in a bit, the reasons why that isn't done so much, but it's alarming. This could be done even in Bitcoin. So, oh, I'll get up to it now. The reason why people can't or don't do this in Bitcoin, actually, a lot of it is the upfront capital allocation costs. That in order to rewrite history, you need to at least temporarily have a majority of capacity, which means you need the hardware to do that, which means you have to pay for the hardware to be able to pull off that attack, which is a lot of sunk cost up front. Although that's not as bad as you would think, because if you buy that hardware, you have that hardware and you can continue to use it or sell it to other people. It would be entirely plausible that at some point, like Bitmain or something, could just take all their new generation of chips that are in inventory and just attack the network while they're sitting on that stuff. Really, I think the main reason it isn't done is because nobody wants to undermine the value of the currency that they're mining, and this would do tremendous damage to that. And also, Bitcoin is a very cash and carry kind of a thing. There really is no leverage over transactions that are being done over the Bitcoin blockchain. So the amount that you can steal from people by your transaction rewriting is actually very low right now. But that is likely to change in the future as you get things like Lightning and more smart contracts and stuff. So it's a concern. So I'm now going to rant. These problems of grinding and rewriting history are generally referred to as nothing at stake. That name is a bunch of propaganda. That name does not describe a problem, it describes a solution, and by stating the solution, it is implying that that's the only solution to that problem, and the solution it's suggesting is not a good solution. In particular, the solution it's implying is that you must have stake, and you must solve it by having a proof of stake system, which is not true. On top of that, so I'm now going to talk about why proof of stake sucks. So first of all, as soon as you go to proof of stake, you've really fundamentally changed your threat model. Bitcoin is this highly decentralized database that anyone can join or leave at any time. If miners leave, if everybody leaves, the system can just kind of keep going. New people can join in and take over and nothing bad happens. If you have a proof of stake system, that isn't true at all. But proof of stake is a decentralized centralized system instead of a decentralized system. So you inherently have a lot of centralization among the stakeholders. Then you start getting just whole categories of issues. So you have this problem about, well, what's the size of your quorum? Well, there are two ways you can go wrong with your quorum. You can make your quorum size be so big that in practice you never get a quorum. Or you can make your quorum size be so small that in practice people can just overwrite the history. And in practice, when you start running numbers, usually what winds up happening is these cross on the wrong side. Instead of there being a range where they're both satisfied, there's a range where neither are satisfied. And that's obviously not a good thing. And another thing implied by nothing at stake is that you have to have some kind of bonding and slashing. People have to put their stuff at risk so that they'll be hurt by bad behavior if they're doing it wrong. Hence the nothing at stake, saying you must stake things so that you can get hurt. So now we have to decide how bonding works. We have to decide what the punishments are. This is not good because if you create incentives for bonding and participation, now you have a problem that people can abuse the benefits they get from bonding and participation and make it look like other people aren't bonding and aren't participating so they can claim all the rewards. If you don't make incentives for bonding and all you have is slashing for your bonding, now why on earth is anyone going to bond? This is a horrible deal. You run the risk that someone else will make it look like you did some bad behavior and get slashed. You can try and get around this by saying, oh, well, we'll just make it so no one ever does bad behavior, which can get them slashed. Well, that's another problem, because as soon as you have a net split, as soon as you have like multiple versions where and someone might form a but there's no majority deciding what the new thing should look like. At this point, someone is going to have to take one for the team and do something which is technically slashing just so you can form a quorum. And why should anybody do that? And you're just hurting them to do it. So that's not a good thing either. The system can just get totally wedged if you're trying to go that way. And then on top of that, even after you've bonded and slashed and everything, and have a few people who are actually sort of kind of behaving reasonably, you're going to need to do K agreement among the people who are actually there, which is a lot of traffic back and forth, and it really doesn't work right. And it always has this like, what's the last message, has weird side issues. So the thing about this, all these things I've been saying, they're not specific attacks. They're like whole categories attacks. They're whole types of things you have to be worried about in a proof of stake system. And that's like staking, bonding, slashing, checkpoints, and K agreement. And when you find yourself this far deep in the hole, it's like, maybe this is not such a hot idea. Maybe if this worked, people would have done it long before Bitcoin. Maybe we wouldn't have needed proof of work if this whole approach really had anything underneath it. So I'm not a big fan of this approach. All right, so now, it turns out there are some not dumb ways of combating grinding and rewriting attacks. So if we can come up with purely technical solutions, then that's great. We have a technical problem, we find a technical solution, the problem goes away, and we don't have to worry about it anymore. So there are a couple of tricks that we can do. First thing is we can bring in verifiable delay functions, or AKA proofs of time. And we can alternate between proofs of space and time. So a verifiable delay function is this thing which takes a challenge and a number of iterations, and it does a calculation based on that challenge where the output is completely canonical, that it requires that number of sequential operations to do, but can be quickly verified. That's a bit of a mouthful there. I'll sort of kind of get into why it needs all those features. It's a new and interesting mathematical primitive. But that will prove highly useful here. We can also, in terms of much more straightforward things, we can split the blockchain between the trunk and the foliage. The trunk contains as little information as possible and is the source of all challenges. It's the thing that determines who wins. So the trunk basically only includes proofs of space, proofs of time, and the occasional rare work difficulty reset, because you can't completely get rid of those. But the challenges come from the trunk, And all the transaction information is included in the foliage, in this thing that's kind of shadowing the trunk. And that's absolutely critical because it's trivial to malleate what transactions you include. That's the functionality of the system, is that you can malleate what transactions you include, because this is supposed to be a secure distributed database. So that is a necessary thing to do. You can also make it so that the proofs of space inherent to the way they work is there's a public key that they will be attached to, and you have to go with that public key if that proof of space works. So all you can really do if you win is go, okay, I'm winning with this particular key. And you can make all of your primitives, all your mathematical primitives, be canonical. That includes the proof of space, the verifiable delay functions, and the signatures must all have unique values and not have things that even look mostly right, but aren't technically the correct thing. And that actually proves to be a bit of a tall order in terms of getting out of things. Like, a lot of signature schemes don't have unique signatures. In particular, Schnorr most definitely does not. Um, uh, and it's required a bunch of new mathematical work to make appropriate proofs of space and verifiable delay functions. There were talks at BPace about the latest and greatest in both of those things that we are currently working on, and I have high confidence are going to work just fine. I am not going to summarize how those work here, because that's a whole other subject. But just for the purposes of this talk, just assume that we have working proofs of space and verifiable delay functions. So yeah, in order to get all this to work, now all we need are new proof of space algorithm, a verifiable delay function, and some method of combining them. So that's only 3 new mathematical primitives necessary to get this whole thing to work. So this is the roadmap I came up with. This talk is not about the proofs of space and the verifiable algorithms. This talk is about how you combine them all together. And there's actually no materials anywhere explaining how to do that, which is why I'm giving this talk, because I want to have a link to send to people to explain what on earth is going on here. This will be the subject of a paper in the future. So first we have to get clear on what the requirements of our proofs of space and time are. So at a high level, we can kind of pretend that the proofs of space are just generating a whole lot of bingo cards somewhere in the range between 0 and 1. Each bingo card is a point on it. That's all tied to a public key, which you will use to cash in your rewards and sign the foliage, basically. The individual bingo cards must be completely non-malleable. You shouldn't, there are 2, well, actually 3 inherent trade-offs that people can do with the whole thing. They can always grind on it by just regenerating their entire plot every time a new challenge comes in. So you want to make it so they kind of have to really regenerate the whole thing, which might take a fair amount of computation and latency to do. Or they can do the honest thing of just generate generating it based on the amount of space that they have. And they might be able to do something somewhere in the middle between those. And you want to make it so that the potential trade-offs, as much as possible, resemble you must do one or the other of these things. There's actually another trade-off you can do, which is someone can always grind by, if your space of potential proofs of space or even verifiable delay functions isn't all that large, someone could just try every possible value and try validating it and see if it worked. Obviously, that's exponential in time, so not really much of a concern, but is a theoretical thing that must be noted. This actually proves to be kind of hard to do. The straightforward thing where you just have the bingo cards is subject to these really interesting Hellman time-space attacks. There's the Beyond Hellman paper, which is what I covered in my talk at BPace, which basically gets the problems under control. There's a little bit of subtlety to actually implementing it in practice, which isn't published yet, but that's not a big deal. Anyway, this is a problem that's under control. The requirements for the verifiable delay function are that it takes a challenge and a number of iterations. It's really important that it be very dynamic about the number of iterations that it take. The minimum depth circuit to solve it has to be linearly proportional to the number of iterations. The constant factor doesn't matter. It just has to be linearly proportional. That is the thing that's going to be important here, because the whole thing is subject to work difficulty factor reset. It must output a canonical solution and a proof. Both of them must be reasonably short, and it has to be possible to validate the solution based on the proof fairly quickly. And the approach we're probably going to be taking is actually using snark proofs. Snarks are these magical things where in principle you can prove anything with a snark. The problem is the snark takes 4 to 8, I don't know, some number of orders of magnitude longer time to run than simple, like, repeated SHA-256 hashing. But if we're clever, we can tweak things to make a VDF where the snark can keep pace. And it has to be infeasible to prove an invalid, to make an invalid proof, even if the amount of time it's going to take, the amount of depth it's going to take to do that is going to be about right. Because for the particular thing we're doing, the outputs of the verifiable delay functions are going to serve as challenges for the next block. So it's very important that they be very, very canonical. This is the reason why there's actually a paper from Eurocrypt that's on, that there's an ePrint up of as of this morning, which is a quite cute construction. It actually got best paper at Eurocrypt. That one is just based on secure hashes. Unfortunately, isn't quite canonical enough. Even though it is a good proof of time, it just doesn't have these really nice super canonical outputs, because this thing really needs to throw the kitchen sink at the whole thing. Anyway, all right, so now we need to hook it all together. So the way we do this is we're going to have a blockchain, and each block in the trunk is going to consist of 2 things. It's going to have a proof of space, and then after that, it's going to have a proof of time, which validates the proof of space, which came before it. The way you find a proof of space is you take the hash of the last proof of time, put it on a point between 0 and 1, and whoever has the closest bingo card wins. The way you enforce that they win is you find the distance between the position of that bingo card and the position of that challenge. That gives you some fraction, some small amount. You then multiply that by the current work difficulty factor and round up to the next integers. This gives you an integer that tells you the number of iterations that the proof of time necessary to validate the whole thing is going to have to run on the challenge, which is the proof of space. Technically, it's going to be the hash of the proof of space and everything before it, but you know. So this does a really good job of making it so you really can't grind on the thing. You can try lots of stuff, but you do have this thing where the not as good things that you try are going to take a longer time to finish. That they are going to inherently be behind. It's not obvious that that's enough, but it does make it so there's really only one piece of discretion left, which for the farmers, which is whether or not they withhold a winning proof of space. They can use their best one or their second or third or fourth best, but really this is the only leverage they have. They can take one away, but they can't but they can't twiddle it too much. Technically speaking, some games can be played with the timing on the work difficulty factors, because when you have a work difficulty reset, this is another thing that comes into play, so you probably want those to be fairly quantized and blah, 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 blah. Anyway, the work difficulty resets are absolutely central, by the way, to how blockchains work, and there's this central fact about the maximum setting on work difficulty resets and why it's greater than, why it's 4, which it appears to be Satoshi Nakamoto knew and just didn't explain to anybody, but there is this not yet published result of doing analysis explaining why that value is 4. Anyway. So when you have this, it's not obvious that this is enough. So there are a few tricks that can be done. One trick that you can do is make it so that when you have a winning block, instead of just using that block to make the next challenge, you sign the proof of space with your public key, and that is used as the input for the VDF that's going to come right after it. This requires unique signatures in order to work properly. But it has this neat thing where if there's someone who has a lot more resources than you, they can't tell what the results are going to be of you winning blocks because they don't know what your signatures are going to look like because they don't have your private key. And there is this lemma, which has been shown in this not yet published results, that if you do this trick, then an attacker is not able to slow you down. If they're introducing things into the system, they can speed you up. They can make your chain grow faster, but they can't make your chain grow slower. And this is a very simple trick to implement and seems good for a number of reasons. So that's a trick to be done. We do, at this point, have really, really good resistance to rewriting attacks. This is fabulous. So let's say that that attacker wants to do the rewriting of history since Genesis attack that we discussed before. In principle, they can do this, right? There is 10 years worth of history. They can redo all 10 years worth of history only using 10 years worth of VDF, which isn't really that much computational power as far as electricity is concerned. By the way, when you start thinking about VDFs a lot, you start getting really, really irritated that CS types talk about time for algorithms. That is not, that word does not mean what you're using it for. Time, as people normally use it, means depth. And time, as people use it in CS, means total amount of computational power. Kind of an important difference, and it starts being really annoying where whenever things say time, you have to start substituting in like computational power in your head, and whenever you want to say time, you have to say depth. But this is for historical reasons. Back when computers were totally not parallel, people thought these were the same thing, and they're not. So this attack is now totally foiled, though. It doesn't create much computation. It doesn't cost much computational power for an attacker to do this, but it uses up a lot of depth. It is going to take them 10 real wall clock years to rewrite the last 10 years of history. Meanwhile, the honest chain is going to have gotten extended a lot more than the amount that they extended their new thing since Genesis, and their attack was all for naught. So that is totally fixed. We got rid of that problem. Depth? It's real circuit depth, like circuit complexity, the depth, the like how many circuits you have to go through from the inputs to the output of the whole thing.
So is that like, is that like the log of computational complexity? Like what's the relationship?
It depends on how parallelizable your algorithms are. That's kind of the whole point here, is we're trying to come up with algorithms that are weird as far as being either very parallelizable or very not parallelizable. In some sense, proofs of space are extremely parallelizable and extremely not possible to do them sequentially, and verifiable delay functions are the exact opposite thing, where you can do them very well sequentially and can't parallelize at all. All right, so we still have the remaining grinding attack. I think I've been going through these slides rather quickly, so plenty of time for Q&A here. Like I said, an attacker always has the option to withhold something, right? Which basically means that they can take their own history, if you have, say, an attacker who's trying to attack the system, they're not cooperating on the main chain at all. They have some amount of storage, and they want to squeeze more utility out of it. So they are not a 51% attacker. They're something less than a 51% attacker, but they want to be able to overtake the main chain by grinding, essentially, doing what little grinding is available to them. And so they do this by just taking every single branch that they can. At every single point in history, instead of just taking their best proof of space, they take like the top 100, the top million, the top whatever, and they do this for every single branch of the entire thing, just ad infinitum. This is going to be a huge exponential blow up that's going to get pretty unpleasant pretty fast. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that an attacker goes ahead and does this. There is this very counterintuitive thing here. I do not have a good intuition for this at all. But it turns out, when you analyze this, and an actual formal analysis has been done, and also empirical simulation has been done, it turns out that even when an attacker tries all infinity of possible things on the space that they have, the amount of extra utility they squeeze out of the space that they have is a small constant factor. It's actually E. I find this really surprising. My intuition is sort of the exact opposite of this. Intuitively, it's like, well, if I'm behind you, it doesn't matter how far ahead or behind you I am. If we're doing a random walk of who gets ahead, if we go far enough ahead, I'm inevitably going to overtake you eventually. So how come like doing infinity of these on top of it doesn't catch up? I don't know. Actually, Christoph, who I'm doing this work with, he went around to the combinatorial mathematicians in his department and asked them all this question, not in the context of blockchains, but just describing it in the abstract, and asked them what they thought, and they all guessed wrong. So makes me feel not quite so bad for having wrong intuitions on this one. Huh?
That was not the proof, just because they failed.
Yeah. No. There is an actual proof here. This has been actually properly analyzed. So, and actually, that factor of E can be improved quite a bit, because, like I said before, in Bitcoin, you just sort of embrace the grinding. You just have everything be grinding. And here you can do a little bit of that. What you do is, for the honest chain, you go, well, the honest chain isn't going to follow infinity of things, but we're going to say for every block height, the honest chain is going to take the first 3 blocks that it can for that. And so that's going to squeeze that difference down. And it turns out that works quite effectively. If you go for like 3, say, then the attacker's advantage is reduced from E 2.7 to 1.6. And they actually have to go quite a bit higher to really get much more out of it after that. And so there's going to be this kind of social convention of just how many the honest chain follows. That's a rather easy number to crank up and a very hard number to crank down. So the plan is we're going to start it at 3, which is a reasonable number, and increase it if that proves to be necessary. There's another thing we might do, which is, instead of just taking that delta, the distance between the bingo card and the challenge, and using it verbatim, we might take its like square or its square root or something. The analysis of that is not done yet on what the trade-offs are and what the consequences of making those changes are. All right, so that was my main thing, and I'll take questions in a minute. I want to rant a little bit here, because I haven't been doing enough of that. People keep coming up to me and asking about different kinds of proof of this, proof of that, proof of the other thing. These tend to not be very good. So I'm going to cover what some of these things are. But I would like to, just as a benchmark, compare them to a type of proof which actually scores relatively well on the scale of these things, but is probably not a good idea. The specific thing I want to compare them to is proofs of bigger dick. So on proofs of bigger dick, someone has trained a deep learning system on images and will rate the quality of dick pics that are posted to the blockchain, and better ones win. Now, this actually is doing fairly well right off the bat, because if we compare it to proofs of participation, proofs of importance, and proofs of more nodes, those aren't locally auditable. You have to have been sitting there following the history the entire time and just sort of kind of trusting people somewhat. If you go offline for a while and come back, you have no way of, in any meaningful way, rating the blockchain. And proofs of bigger dick, to its credit, has a defined formula for how you calculate these things. So it's already doing pretty well there. The other problem is most of these supposedly useful proofs aren't really that useful. We don't need more big prime numbers and stuff. If you look at usage numbers for like Pornhub and stuff, it appears to be that there is some amount of market for dick pics in the world. So it's actually kind of doing better than most of the proposals on that one. The scoring functions, and this is where proofs of bigger dick really falls down pretty much the same way almost everything else does. The scoring functions don't correlate well with the intended values. If you are training something, almost any deep learning system for evaluating images can be fooled with things that don't even vaguely look anything whatsoever like the images that it's supposed to be going for using our current technology. And the quality outputs of these do not follow a nice exponential distribution in the slightest. In particular, they cluster a lot. You can just flip a few pixels and it still looks like a great answer to something. That said, an awful lot of these proofs of things that people propose have dynamically supplied challenges. So if someone wanted to do something for general fetishes, someone might happen to have a particularly good picture of, I don't know, a three-titted whore from Mars, and so they query the network asking for one, and then they can claim their own rewards for that one. However, actually, compared to proofs of useful storage, of archival storage, the general fetishes one is really doing a lot better, because at least you'd have to keep around the picture of the three-titted whore from Mars, where proofs of useful storage, you don't even have to do that, because you can just take a key and use this in counter mode to just generate completely fake data, which everyone else has to actually store the data to claim the rewards later, and you yourself don't have to do that, you just store the seed. And there's no way to detect it because these are supposed to all be encrypted files which just look like garbage anyway. So I'm not a big fan of most other types of proof of X, Y, and Z. They're kind of stupid. All right, that's my whole presentation. Do people have any questions? Yeah.
The attack where you recompute your proof of space, there seems to be, right, there is an implicit assumption or that recomputing a new proof of space to get a different.
Yeah. So at some point,
So
at some point you have to have created a proof of space, right? So trivially, if you want this feature that people can join and leave whenever they want to, it has to be possible that when a challenge comes up, someone who only has X space can make it look like 10X space by generating a proof of space on it, checking for the best thing they can, rewriting it with another one, checking for the best thing they can, and doing this repeatedly. So you can't stop this attack, but you can make it unpleasant to do.
Yeah, but what are the requirements on the time then that the proof of space needs to take?
You really want it to take high latency on that. In practice, the latency on these things is going to be quite large, actually, because they're doing rewriting of large chunks of disk. So you just kind of make it so that the minimum size on these things is big enough that the latency is kind of high.
So that ends up being a parameter in the formal proof.
It does sort of wind up being a parameter. In practice, you can always make it, it's a soft fork to increase the minimum size of plots that are necessary. So that can just be increased over time.
Sure, but in the analysis of the security of this mechanism that you're saying is
So the analysis that has been done so far hasn't been particularly strong on looking at the amount of It's really looking more at the amount of computational power rather than the latency of creating, of redoing plots. Although I think empirically the latency is going to be much more of a hurdle than the computational requirements of redoing them over and over again. But mostly the analysis is looking at the trade-offs, right? So it's assuming you can use an amount of computation equal to this size, or you can have that done up front and reuse it over and over again and just do like one lookup every time a challenge comes in. And you want it to be that those are kind of your two options, and that there's nothing that does a particularly good job of scoring better than both of those in terms of both space and time. Although it would be nice to have some better color on what the minimum latency is for setting up a plot as well. That hasn't really been analyzed or optimized for. Although in practice, when you're storing something like on a hard drive, it just takes a certain amount of time to rewrite an entire hard drive. Like they only write at a certain rate.
Well, some proofs of space also have this, and some inherently sequential component. Is that in the common?
It doesn't. So the analysis so far doesn't really talk about that, and a lot of what's going on is a lot of sorting on disk. So sorting isn't really that inherently sequential, but in practice, when you're storing on an outside media, because it's really huge, that's going to serialize a lot of things. Yes?
So, you pointed out that one of the big sort of problems with something like Bitcoin is it drives all this sort of kind of horrible misallocation of resources and all sort of, wasted effort in computing things like large primes, which could be computing something useful. Even gold mining, well, we can use gold to make jewelry or circuits. It's not completely wasted. But what's to prevent people from, building new classes of storage that are optimized for these sort of proofs of space, but completely useless for everything else?
It's because the requirements of the proof of space are an almost perfect match for what you actually use storage for normally. It's like bits are bits. It just looks like storage. If you're talking about things to compute, I don't know, convolutions or something, or SHA-256 hashes, then whenever you talk about any specific operation, custom hardware can really, really outperform a general purpose CPU for any specific computation you can name. But when it comes to storage, mass storage media is already very, very well optimized for as many bits as possible, as cheaply as possible, with very, very slow access times. And that's exactly what proofs of space need. It's like maybe tape drives can do something, right? So you might have some better trade-offs with those, but that winds up looking pretty dodgy because you have to do these lookups, and tape drives are really slow at lookups.
The sort of thing that I would imagine would be, something like a kind of, stable DRAM-like storage that would sort of align the necessity to store the complete interval from, block A to block A plus 100 by some kind of custom computation that would be computed.
Yeah, so the Beyond Hellman paper is all about making that impossible. For algorithmic reasons, you can't get away with that. But DRAM would be horrible for this because DRAM is way, way more expensive than mass storage media. And you have this thing where mass storage media, you can set a bit and just leave it that way until the end of time, and it's not costing you more power, where memory is costing you power just sitting there doing nothing, and it's much, much more expensive to generate in the first place.
We've got lots of talks on new kinds of storage technology that are somewhere between, are on this continuum between, hard drives and DRAM, variants of flash, et cetera.
Yeah, I believe that almost anything that is actually useful for proofs of space, because proofs of space requirements of lookup times are so lax, and is all about the amount of space. Basically, almost anything that's useful for proof of space will also be useful for just normal storage and will cause people to be buying it just for normal storage. So you're still going to be tapping into the unutilized resources in mass storage that people have acquired just for doing mass storage.
We were saying that latency is also a consideration for avoiding the re-space computation attack, right, where you regenerate your proofs of space.
Yeah, it's a nice to have.
Sure, but if someone wants to optimize therefore the latency access, so it's cheaper for them to recompute their proofs of space.
If someone is okay with swallowing the computational overhead of redoing the space over and over again, which might by itself completely wipe out the utility of doing it, because you have a block coming in every 5 minutes. If you are just staying online and do this once, you get this factor of thousands over a month, right? But if you're okay with swallowing that computation because you did some hardware to do it, then maybe you could get away with it, and it would be nice to make it so that the proof of space setup also had a fairly significant sequential element to it. And the ones which we have right now don't really do that, but that would be a nice to have.
The ones that are based on pebbling graphs do, but you're saying they're...
So pebbling graphs have lots of nice features to them. They are very complicated and have annoying constant factors in them. And they are missing one big feature, which is they are not canonical at all. They're very easy to malleate, so that actually creates a lot of problems. Yeah. Yes?
So I kind of have an inverse of his question.
Yeah.
So it could be that this isn't a problem unless you have high frequency stuff going on. But your premise at the very beginning was 50% of the storage is not being used.
Yeah.
The reason people have extra storage
Yeah.
is because they're creating a buffer for some kind of unexpected peak in demand so that they can respond. So what happens in your system if a player all of a sudden, because they have this set up for some other application, that other application needs all that space?
There's actually a really fun thing you can do, which is you take your storage media, and before you start doing anything with it, you put a pot over it. You get it set up for farming a priori. And you then put your real file system on top of it. And you can do really fun things here. Like if it's a RAID, you can crack open the RAID for the farming, so it's not actually being good at being redundant on the farming because you don't care about that. But you have this garbage underwritten. And as far as the real file system is concerned, it just needs to zero stuff out if it wants to zero stuff out. If it just allocates a file, there's going to be garbage there, right? But you rely on the fact that modern storage file systems don't overwrite everything when they first start up. They only overwrite stuff when they have to. So you have your farmer sitting there accessing this in read-only mode, and whenever a challenge comes in, it just goes and looks up the spot that it needs to go look up to get its response, and if that area of the disk has been overridden, then, oh well, you miss out.
What's the cost of missing out?
You lose out on the farming rewards, potentially, for that.
So then it becomes a frequency problem.
Presumably, you are getting utility out of using this storage, right? You're getting this kind of just extra gravy money out of the farming of the media, but there's multiple billions of dollars worth of resources being put towards farming, handing out possibly hundreds of millions of dollars worth of rewards. So whatever utility you have of writing your actually useful data over your storage is going to be getting you more value than the farming that you were doing is just this gravy money on it beforehand. So you're okay with having that happen. Yes?
So you're creating then a secondary market for bad disk drives?
Maybe. It sort of depends what's meant by bad disk drives.
Ones with lots of bad blocks.
Yeah, well, it's weird because if a hard drive merely has a whole bunch of bad blocks, you can just note what the bad blocks are and not use them. So I'm not sure how many rejects places get. There might be some utility here to taking factory reject hard drives and using them just for farming. I don't know what the economics of that are likely to be. I figure at least it's just kind of making storage cheaper, if that's happening. Yes.
So we only have the problem that, a lot of GPU cards that I might want to buy are scarce and hard to come by, or the price is no good because they get bought up by all these mining operations. Now what you seem to be telling me is that maybe the same thing will happen to hard drives. So what other computer components do you expect will
Well,
be eaten up by currencies?
Well, no. The idea is for it to
Mixed
not.
next,
The idea is for it to not happen to hard drives. So we actually ran some numbers, and in this very like socialistic central planning way, decided what the future storage market is going to look like for what we're doing. And we decided in this like horrible nightmare scenario where the value of our cryptocurrency winds up being equivalent to M1. Like it turns out M1 and gold are about the same value. It's about $4 trillion. So we've run the numbers and we've set it up so that if the value of our cryptocurrency hits $4 trillion, which I don't know, that wouldn't be the end of the world for me personally, but if it hits $4 trillion, the amount of rewards that are going to be happening are only going to be around $20 billion a year. And since people spend like $150 billion a year and going up on storage media, that wouldn't totally screw up that entire market. It's tapping into what is already a very, very big and underutilized resource. Yes.
So if we assume that disk drives go away and are replaced entirely by flash, there's one other economic component, which is the limitation to the number of read-write cycles that are inherent in flash. Disk drive, there's maybe there's some kind of limit, but it's not.
My understanding is that the overwriting limits on flash has gotten better over time. As far as how much overwriting is necessary for plotting something, it's like we haven't decided how many passes it's going to be, but it's going to be like 2 or 3 passes over the hard drive. It basically sorts on disk a couple of times. But it's not obliterating the disk. It's doing a little bit of access to everything, and then it stops. And then it's just reading. It's doing it's doing like 1 read per challenge, basically. Yes.
I'm naive in this whole area.
Yeah.
What happens if somebody with very large resources, Amazon or Google, decides to attack this problem?
So if someone has close to a majority of the thing, if they have a very large fraction of everything, they can probably fuck shit up pretty badly. The idea is that you want to be using something that's already decentralized out there, that empirically, because there are rewards for joining and there's already a wide group of people who have these resources to play, that you won't have anyone who's a majority player right out of the gate, and the amount of decentralization of the system keeps it from ever really getting attacked. And by that metric, Bitcoin isn't really doing all that well. Bitcoin actually is fairly centralized. If the government of China wanted to fuck shit up, they could totally do it.
They're going to probably.
Yeah, the storage appears to be much, much more decentralized in terms of the amount that's out there. Although it's interesting because the questions of how decentralized is storage really and how much unutilized storage capacity really is out there and where is it. On some level, we don't really know. And the easiest way to find out is run the experiment of make a proof of space-based cryptocurrency and see where the farming starts happening. Yeah.
I missed it, but how do you intend to enforce the minimum size of the plot?
Oh, that's just a rule. When you generate a proof of space, part of how the proof of space works is it does tell you the size of the plot that generated it.
Okay.
So you can soft fork increasing the minimum size. So that there will be a size up front, probably like a terabyte, and that might be increased in the future. Any more questions? Yes.
The M1 number you used, was that just US? It seems
I
to me it
believe
was-
that was US. Yeah.
Yeah, so if you really were going to do that analysis, you'd want to have M1 on a global basis, not for the
Yeah,
US.
I think that's only like probably less than an order of magnitude bigger, but that could fuck shit up. I mean, it's sort of. If we hit that, I would be personally by far the richest person on earth. So I would be crying all of that way to the bank in that situation. I don't expect that to happen. It was just a useful exercise to try and make sure that our numbers worked over, like basically like what if our market cap is anywhere in a range from 100 million to 4 trillion, and make sure that it works well across that entire range. And it turns out by setting an appropriate schedule and stuff, that is totally doable. And that's a pretty big range. That's 4.5 orders of magnitude. Yes.
So it seems like, because with Bitcoin at least, the transaction cost is really high, which means that which really kind of limits its killer apps to things that you can't, use Visa to pay for. And usually that means
People talk a lot of bullshit about what Bitcoin does and does not need to do. So I have this roadmap for cryptocurrencies, which is not really different from the Bitcoin Core Dev's roadmap for cryptocurrencies. It's like, well, how do you scale? Like, well, you can't do on-chain scaling like at all. That's clearly not going to happen. On-chain scaling is big enough for what it needs to be, which is it needs to be big enough that trying to screw everything up by making transaction fees hits the roof is cost prohibitive, as it appears to be somebody learned recently when they cranked up the price of fees. That's going to cost you $10 million a day, which is not very sustainable. So in that sense, the size of the blockchain is big enough right now. As far as scaling in the future goes, as far as getting scaling and making it so that transactions go through quicker, the obvious step one is you start using Lightning Network. You're basically switching to net settlement, which is the way banks work. And then once Lightning is up and running, which is happening, then you start doing like federated channels. So someone can have a piece of a channel and have some kind of security on that happening, so you can go to net settlement and start doing things so you can have real custody arrangements over that as well, involving some things that are sort of, that covenants can in principle do that. It appears to be much simpler things than covenants might be able to get you a lot of that functionality actually. So you wind up having this system where you have the blockchain, which is kind of like FedWire, and then you have Lightning, which is kind of like Swift, and then you have some layer below that, which is kind of like just bank accounts. And that can just scale up globally, and you can set up like covenants and stuff over that, so you have real custody arrangements. And that can work, and then you can just do banking. It can become this substitute for banking, which is both more secure and more expedient and cheaper than Visa is, and can kind of beat Visa at its own game, which doesn't, in principle, look that hard to do, because, I mean, you look at the way payments are done and it's comical. Like, you take out your credit card and you put it into a thing, and then it electronically generates a record of this transaction that you made, and the way it communicates this record to you is it prints it out on a piece of paper that they then hand to you and you go scan in elsewhere. This is just stupid and archaic and ridiculous. So,
well, it has some nice properties, like you get a piece of paper. I mean, that's a good property. I mean, like, it's nice for voting machines as well, right?
No, but just compared to what you actually want, is we're just getting this electronically with every single one of these is just ludicrous, and it has no transparency over what the custody arrangements are, and like where things might just get retroactively pulled out of your bank account after the fact. There's scam artists who take advantage of people not knowing that just because you deposited a check and it's been a month, that does not mean that the money won't just disappear from your account. So the banking is horrible at its core things that it's doing, and trying to replicate that, trying to do better by starting with cryptocurrency seems kind of ridiculous, because you're hobbling yourself. You're using this, like, you're optimizing for ridiculous levels of decentralization and security, when obviously Visa could just fix this stuff by actually fixing it, and that wouldn't even be hard to do. But they seem to have no interest in actually fixing it, so we're going to have to go through the back door, building this ridiculous system, and then build all this functionality on top of it, to, in the end, hopefully beat Visa like at its own game.
Are people hypothesizing on how Visa is going to fix this when it gets to interesting for them to do that?
I don't know.
So there was a time when there was a dominant communications company in the United States. It was called Western Union Telegraph Company. And they served telex machines. Paper tape, remember paper tape?
Mm-hmm.
And they were confronted with 60 baud dial-up modems. And their solution was to make a higher speed telex machine.
Yeah.
Western Union Telegraph Company then announced some years later that they were retreating to their core business, which is allowing you to go into a drugstore and transfer money from the United States to Mexico.
Yeah.
And the whole communications network doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And so if you look at these kinds of historical events, you know, the buggy whip manufacturers seldom
Yeah.
find a way to make the transition to the new.
Western Union still exists to this day. People still use it to send cash from one point to another. The amount of time it takes and the amount of expenses that you incur doing this lose to doing the same thing using Bitcoin. That's just
absolutely.
embarrassing.
I didn't mean that they were a challenge to Bitcoin.
Yes.
I just meant that from having a network which
Yeah.
was the dominant network in the United States, they went to having nothing.
Yeah.
And they have this little business of
Yeah.
transferring money across
Yeah,
the
it is often the case that the entrenched players just don't get the memo that they need to upgrade their systems and they just die. You get these things that are just ridiculous. Like if you look at smart transactions and go, well, what smart transactions are really useful? Like if you're a bank, what smart transactions should you start using? And there's this very short list of smart transactions that aren't stupid, right? Like, so you can do things like ERC-20. So great, you can do illegal unlicensed securities and pretend that they're not securities because you have and that supposedly is magic pixie dust that makes the SEC not care, except it turns out they do. But if you look at smart transactions that aren't stupid, pretty much top of the list is atomic swaps. Atomic swaps are a neat thing. They actually recently got improved, so they don't even require secure hash preimages anymore, as long as you're using aggregatable signatures. Atomic swaps are great because if you have two different financial institutions, both of whom have very lightly trusted, auditable public ledgers of what they do, not blockchains, just information about their records, that support really, really minimal smart transactions, it becomes possible to do an atomic swap between different institutions, which makes it so that escrow should cost like nothing. You just do an escrow, like because you trust the two banks reasonably. They're both big banks. They're not untrusted, and so you just do escrow across the two of them in this way. And maybe they're auditors of their ledgers, so you have to trust them even less, right? Now banks look at this and go, oh, we kind of like charging 1% to do an escrow because it's no work and you make 1% of $10 million. And they're like, no, we don't want this to happen at all. We have no interest in this technology moving forward in the slightest. And they don't do anything about it. So that's why we don't have atomic swaps. That's why we don't have banks making lightly trusted, auditable public ledgers so that we can get rid of our escrow fees, because the banks don't want it.
One other historical note.
Mm-hmm.
How long did it take for the world to get from the first introduction of currencies to a trusted currency?
Yeah, it gets to be sort of an existential question of what
So it's
trusted
about
means.
4,000 years.
Oh.
So it wasn't until the 1600s with the British pound.
Yeah, although you
Yeah.
did before that have all these things that were like backed by something. Someone was storing chits or something, and you sort of had a seal on it, and you.
Well, there were essentially swaps, and trusted swaps, but
Yeah.
but it was
Yeah.
shaky,
Yeah.
and they kept blowing up every time somebody went to war, and somebody always went to war, so they were not reliable. And people were actually, the acid test was to put acid on the coin to see.
Yeah.
So
So
I think we're at the very early stage of working with cryptocurrencies.
Yeah, cryptocurrencies are very early stage technology right now, and there's definitely a lot of insanity around investments in them at the moment, which is fueling a fair number of just outright scams. But the technology is really interesting.
Yes.
And so I'm working on improving the actual technology.
And I think it's great, and eventually, I think we will need to have a trusted digital currency. I mean, it's just a fundamental requirement of the planet, given how we're evolving. So, and what you're doing is great. I wish I understood it better.
Yeah, well, one thing that's happened in the space is that the available materials to explain cryptocurrencies to people have really improved a lot over time. It used to be there was a very small cabal of people who really knew how anything worked, and even they weren't super great at explaining it. They were willing to answer my questions, but they weren't willing to answer many other people's questions. But over time, more and more people have understood it, and there are actual classes now, and there are textbooks, and there are available materials for explaining what's going on. It's unfortunate that not more work is being really done on the core stuff, because everyone's all excited about doing new ICOs and not on actually building real technology. Any more questions?